Hi everyone, my name is Abby from Migration Centre of Australia. Today we're going to be talking about everything visitor visa. Now, what is the visitor visa for Australia? What did the history of over the past year look like for the visitor visa of Australia? And what do we think is going to be the approach of the government in 2025 for this visitor visa? So let's start with the history. Now, there's multiple types of visitor visas. They've got the Subclass 601, which is the ETA, Electronic Travel Authority, followed by the 651, which is the e-visitor visa. Now, only certain passport holders can access these. Then we've got 5 streams within the Subclass 600, which is the main visa that's utilized for most of the countries. Now, these 5 streams are tourist stream, then business visitor stream, family sponsored stream, approved destination stream, which is mainly for China, and then the frequent traveler stream. Let's talk about what's happened with this visa in 2024. Now, in 2024, there were over 5 million applications that were lodged. To be exact, 5,274,215 applications. Most of these were from China. Well, majority of these, that was the highest population that had applied for the visa in financial year 2024, which starts from 1st July 2023 to the end of 30th June 2024. Now, from this, China had 708,000 applications approximately, and this was an increase of 114.5% compared to the previous financial year. Now, the other thing we want to cover is a total of applications that were approved out of these 5,274,000. That was 4,713,000, right? So approximately about 500,000 applications for the visitor visa were actually refused. Now, in the scheme of things, that seems like it's just a bit over 10%. So that means most of the applications were actually granted. Now, this applies to just the tourism and business stream of the visitor visa. Now, the total applications that were granted were actually up 23.4% from the previous financial year. So you can see that there is an increase of visas being granted every year, and there's a higher population that is coming to Australia to visit. There was 337,000 people in Australia on 30th June 2024, which is about a 2.2% increase from the previous financial year. So at a time, we estimate that there's anywhere between 300,000 to maybe in the peak over Christmas and New Year's, maybe 500,000 people in Australia on the tourist visa. Now, a key initiative that was introduced in the last financial year was ASEAN, which is the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, to improve the visa access to Australia from these countries and Timor-Leste. Now, what are these countries that are covered as part of this? That's Brunei, Burma, Cambodia, Indonesia, Laos, Malaysia, Philippines, Singapore, Thailand, and Vietnam. So if you're from these countries, there is more of a chance of your visitor visa getting granted in this financial year, which is from 1st July 2024 to 30th June 2025 and beyond, right? Because there was this discussion that took place between Australia and the Asian countries. While visitor visa numbers in Australia continue to trend upwards, they are yet to return to pre-COVID levels, where a total of 5,274,215 applications were lodged in the previous financial year, which is still 12% lower than what it was pre-COVID, right? So we expect these to climb up in the financial year 2025 and 2026. Governments have increased their expenditure. Australia is heading more into deficit. So we expect them to not only increase taxes, but increase how they will make money as an economy. One of the major advantages of Australia is that it's such a good destination to travel to. And visitors used to provide, or tourists used to provide, one of the highest level of income sources for the Australian government and its economy. So we expect this to start increasing because now they've put restrictions on what you can do on the visitor visa. You can no longer just apply for a student visa if you come on a visitor visa to Australia. which a lot of people were doing before and abusing the visitor visa program, and you need to justify the genuine temporary entrant criteria to be able to get the visitor visa and the student visa. Now that they've put this restriction, they may be more lenient towards granting the visas, especially for younger people, because they can no longer take that approach. But the other way is, we get a lot of questions saying, okay, I'm here in Australia on a visitor visa. How can I stay here if I want to settle here because they've just loved the country so much? Now, we know that we can't do a student visa, but there are still other skilled visa options that you can approach. Mainly, these are going to be the sponsorship options through employers if you're looking for something quick. If you have time, then you can potentially look at other things like trying to get an invitation from the state or federal government, but that requires a lot of planning to try and get that invitation. It can sometimes take months or sometimes takes years, and some people don't get invited at all. So it's a really uncertain pathway, but there is that option too. Whereas if you have an employer, that's more of a certain pathway that you can apply. And if you meet the criteria, generally that visa is granted as well. Now, one of the other things is Australia has digitalized a lot of its process for visitor visas as well. The visitor visas are now processed across multiple locations around the world. And when you come into the country, if you have an e-passport, you can pretty much walk through much quicker. What this means is more visitors can come into Australia every day because the screening of those visitors from an international terminal is much quicker. There are still high risk and low risk countries. So if you're from a high risk country, I would say India is still considered a little bit of high risk depending on where you're from and what your financial background is like. There's some African countries, South American countries, some other countries in Asia which may still be considered high risk. A lot of the developing countries are not considered high risk, and a lot of those countries already have access to either the working holiday visa or work and holiday visa. The other visas for the visitor visa that we discussed earlier, which is the 601 and the 651 subclasses, which is the e-visas and the ETA visa. So it's important to understand how your country ranks, and depending on whether it's considered low risk or high risk, if it's the higher the risk, the more preparation and documentation should go into justifying why you need to come to Australia. Why should you be granted the visa? How long are you planning to stay? What are you planning to do? Who are you planning to visit? Do you have the finances? What do you have to go back to in your home country? All of these things need to be provided. So the officer, rather than making a decision, either gives you a chance to comment and provide further information, or leans towards a positive decision. If you don't provide enough evidence, a visitor visa can still be refused straight away without them asking for any further documentation. Now, biometrics and processing time, depending on which country you're from and the duration of your visitor visa, you may be required to obtain biometrics. The processing times can vary. Now, depending on which country you're from and depending on what the department is prioritizing, the processing time can be anywhere between a few days to a couple of months, we've even seen. But generally, within a month, in most cases, you will have a decision on your visitor visa. Now, if you do delay anything like health examinations or biometrics, if they're required, that can certainly cause delays with your visitor visa application. Now, the other question we get is, do I need to provide financial evidence? Yes, in most cases you should. Should that financial evidence be 3 months bank statement, 6 months or 12 months? Depending on the risk level of your country, we would say the higher the risk, the longer the bank statement you should have and the more amount of money you should have. This is purely because it strengthens the application. Rather than you maybe borrowing money from someone and then keeping it in your account for 3 months, you have transactions over 12 months to not only show income, but show that those funds have been there for a much longer time. Now, Condition 8558, this is only for visas that are generally granted for 3-year periods. So if you've been granted a visa for 3 years, it'll have the condition that you can only stay in Australia for 12 months in any 18-month period. For simplification, let's start on the 1st of January 2025. Let's say your visa was granted on 1st of Jan and you came to Australia on 2nd of Jan 2025. You can stay for 12 months in any 18-month period. So you can stay from 2nd Jan to 1st of Jan 2026. Then you fly out of the country and you need to be outside the country for 6 months. So you can then enter the country again on 2nd July 2026. And because within any 18-month period, you can only stay 12 months. And then from 2nd July 2026, you can stay another 12 months, right? And then leave Australia. There's better ways of structuring this to make sure you utilize the time frame. You could actually do 12 months, then 6 months out of the country, then 6 months into the country, 6 months out of the country, and then 12 months in the country potentially, right? So there's better ways of structuring it to maximize that duration that you are in Australia from that one visa, because it says the last entry must be made within that 3-year period. So as long as you enter the country within that 3-year period and then stay in Australia for another 12 months since that last entry is allowed. But you also need to make sure you meet the condition 8558, that you don't breach the 18-month rule. You cannot have stayed in Australia for more than 12 months in any 18-month period. Then there is the condition 8501. Now, most visitor visa subclass 600s will have this. You will need to maintain health insurance while in Australia. This is a mandatory requirement. If something happens, you need to make sure that you can cover yourself or your insurance can cover you for any major expenses or incidentals. Now, you can also lodge group applications. So maybe you're traveling as a group of people or multiple families or multiple friend groups, and you can lodge this together and say, yes, you're traveling as part of a group. It'll generate a code for you and you share that same code into each of the applications. Sometimes what can happen is 1 or 2 applications or certain amount of applications may take longer to process because of some delay or something that's been flagged on the department's end. Generally, they are processed together or very similar amount of time frame. Sometimes we've also seen that due to some complications or the officer looking into something has realized that they cannot grant a visa based on a criteria not being met. So other people in a group are granted the visa, but some people may not be granted the visa. So it doesn't mean that everyone in a group will be refused. It can be the case that someone in a group or some people in a group are refused, but the others are granted. Now, if the visitor visa is refused, what can you do? Now, if the visitor visa is refused, you may have the right to appeal the decision. Now, this depends where you're located and the type of application that was made. Especially if it was family sponsored, the sponsor would be able to appeal the decision. Now, with the recent changes, visitor visa applicant can also appeal the decision. Then, if you're outside Australia, you may be able to appeal the decision as well on a general tourist visa, depending on the rights you have. But if you're in Australia and on a bridging visa when the application is refused, you will be subject to Section 48 bar, which means if you received a refusal while on a bridging visa, you cannot apply for most other visas while in Australia. There is a list of visas that you can apply for, but they're very limited. Now, that pretty much summarizes all of the visitor visas and the questions we've had related to this and what the visitor visa will look like for 2025. We think immigration levels will only increase for this visa. We estimate that Australia would be looking to target a 6 million people visit for this financial year, and I assume they'd be very close to that. From the approvals that we've seen this year, there has been a higher rate of approval. Again, depends on which country they're from. We have also knocked back a lot of people that require our services for visitor visas, depending on which country they're from. So especially from Sri Lanka, we've had to say no to clients because of the high risk that it causes, and we don't want clients to unnecessarily spend on our services when we think there's a likelihood that it may be refused. So please make sure you look into these kinds of economic factors when applying for a visitor visa, and take this into consideration to make sure you strengthen your application where necessary. For a recent friend, we've had people fly into the country for a visit from Sri Lanka as well. So it all depends on how you prepare an application and how much you're able to strengthen it. If you have any questions, comment below. If you need our services, head to our website to book in a consultation and we'll help you where we can.